People who escaped authoritarian governments, when did you know it was the right time for you to leave your country? I'm from Myanmar and Burma. Most of us young people left the country when they enacted the conscription law. Now, you can't leave the country unless you've done military service, which in this case means until you pass away because there's a civil war going on and they need more people. Story 2. Not me, but I remember asking my mom why she left the Philippines in the 70s. She explained about the Marcos regime and how he declared martial law. She said when that was announced, she knew she had to leave. She had been working towards moving anyway, but she said that was her cue to hurry it up. Story 3. The police just started pestering people on the streets after one of the protests in Belarus. Some of them got terminated, some injured, thousands were imprisoned. It's still happening. Also, I kind of was prepared for that psychologically for a long time before the violence erupted, because it was concealed for years. So when everything happened, I just took the first morning flight out and left for another country. This is in 2 words. The story is a bit more complicated, obviously. Story 4. I used to know a cleaner who was from Haiti. The right time was in 1980 when Tonton Makauti came for her husband, a political dissident. That was the last time her and the kids saw him. And in the case of my first girlfriend, the daughter of a South Vietnamese general, they left the country in a small boat. When Saigon fell, during the crossing, the smugglers told her parents either you give up all your gold or we'll mistreat the women. They arrived in France with nothing. The father, a doctor, was then able to work, but not for the same salary as the French. He passed away a few years later, plunging the whole family into poverty. Once in a while, her mother would tell about what she had left in Vietnam. Story 5. When they arrested members of the opposition party for holding a primary, when police stormed and shut down the headquarters of the only newspaper still critical of the government, when nonviolent protesters were given longer sentences than violent convicts for having posters in their backpacks, when the heads of government were one by one replaced by toads with neither qualifications nor experience, purely based on their bum-kissing rhetoric, when they start passing legislation that you know will hurt people and they don't care. When an extra panel of judges were suddenly appointed above the Supreme Court with final decision on interpreting the law. When caring about it makes you lose sleep and starts to affect your work quality. It was never one thing, but you just see it getting worse and worse step by step and you make a judgment call. The timing and reasons will be different between all your friends and family. Story 6. My grandfather, the bravest man I have ever known, fled Germany shortly before the Nuremberg laws were passed in late 1935. He had been a lawyer and had arranged everyone's passports, hidden some gold away, and established a place for them to flee. The judiciary was already under control of the regime. He took his wife and 5 children and crossed France into Belgium, and by 1936, he was applying for asylum to multiple countries, including the US, where he knew people in the embassy. He was summarily denied. As they began invading Belgium in May of 1940, the family fled along the coast on foot, separating children and adults so as not to all be traveling together, hoping their odds were better. My grandmother and my 2 aunts were caught a few days into the trip and were ended at Treblinka. The eldest son, Mikhail, was caught foraging food by the in southern France and summarily ended on the spot. My father, who was 9, his younger brother Joseph, and my grandfather fled into northern Spain and were hidden by the remnants of the Zamoristas in Catalonia. Joseph developed pneumonia and passed away somewhere in northern Spain. My grandfather and father were smuggled into Portugal onto a boat and eventually made it to New Palestine. After the war, my grandfather had had enough of the Zionists and he was finally granted a U.S. immigration visa and came here in 1947. I was born on American soil in 1961. I grew up hearing the stories. I guess this crap just follows my DNA. Story 7. 2 sets of my great-parents fled before World War I, which really shows some good instincts on their part. One was in the Austrian army. As allies, he could see war possibly ramping up by Germany. He knew he would be sent to fight on a side he felt was wrong. It is said he did not like the Kaiser, so he got fake papers, taught his 4 children how to speak Ukrainian, and they escaped to Canada. All of this was a big risk. To this day, we're not sure if we are the result of illegal immigration or grandma's maiden name is even correct. She continued the game by being Ukrainian her whole life and celebrating Ukrainian Christmas. Given the anti-German/Austrian sentiment after both wars, I suspect they just kept on pretending and still used the fake papers. Her father passed away within a year of settling here. A child was born on British waters during the trip here, so she may have had dual citizenship. The other great-grandfather was German. They were scared that they would be sent to war. They found the Kaiser unpalatable. He and his brother ran before World War I as well. He settled here in Canada, his brother in the USA. They both got married fairly quickly. They met up a couple years later and discovered they were married to full sisters by some freaking chance. The American side 1 generation later ran a very successful company. My grandfather met his cousin towards the end of his life. They called themselves brothers as they were the result of 2 brothers marrying 2 sisters. Double cousins. They looked like each other. Story 8. I left the US in March. I learned from my grandparents, leave before, better to regret moving than not. I have an autistic child and my husband is European. Now we are finding our way here. I'm keeping money in various accounts, enough to fly to Uruguay with inflated ticket prices and 3 months' rent if things go south here too. I can laugh and tell myself I overreacted. My pride can handle that, but I cannot survive if my family is hurt because of my inaction. Story 9. I was born in the USSR and watched it collapse when I was 7. Getting out for me was never a question of when it's right, but when I'm able. By the time I was 21, I was legally orphaned and had graduated cum laude from the best college in the country. However, my English wasn't good enough to qualify for an international graduate school program. I spent another year in a local graduate program paying a lab colleague to teach me English after hours. Nobody believed I would follow through with my intention to enroll in a grad program at Ohio State University. Russia at the time was experiencing peak economic growth, and the government was pumping so much money into science and technology that former USSR expatriates were coming back from the US under promises of becoming local science superstars. It never fooled me. It was very clear that these programs were purely for show, and the processes were not meant to be fair or merit-based. Everyone was telling me what a fool I was to leave a clean and beautiful Moscow metropolis for the Midwest. I landed in Columbus, Ohio in 2006 with $300 and never came back. 15 years later, when the first bombs were dropped on Ukraine, panic settled in. My friends abandoned their businesses, properties, and families to get out. My cousin, a male of military age, stayed until conscription was announced. Due to geographical luck, our town is a few dozen miles from the border. He managed to get a last-minute train ticket and cross the border to Kazakhstan 3 years ago. Did I foresee the catastrophic relapse into a militarized autocracy when I left in 2006? No. Upward mobility and economic opportunities in Russia were the best they had ever been in 2006, but they still remained unreachable for 95% of the population, myself included. I took no joy in my decision. It was made out of desperation, and if I had known the struggles awaiting me, I doubt I would have had the courage. Imagine how it felt on November 6, 2024, after spending 2 decades getting the coveted US passport, to wake up in the second iteration of Trump country. You think catastrophic collapse can't happen here? The erosion of civility happens slowly, but the system is crumbling in front of you, and way too many people are oblivious to what they're witnessing. Story 10. I can tell you this, prepare your backup plan. Having a US passport makes it easier. I grew up in Soviet times through the collapse of the Union and the wild 90s. I went to the USA in 1999 as a student but decided I didn't want to stay there. I didn't feel I could live in that country, I just didn't like the way of life. So I went back to my homeland and many folks thought I was crazy. But I love my country and really hoped back then that things would change. However, I decided I would have a backup and took the opportunity to get legal status in Germany, even though I don't like it here much. But being in IT makes it a bit easier. 2020 showed us in Belarus that we are screwed for another generation. Luckily, I had my German permit, so I moved my family, leaving lots of things behind and started a new kind of life. While I still wait for the time I can go back, the fact that I had a backup helped me escape the risk of imprisonment and allowed my kids and wife to live in a more secure environment, at least for now. At the moment, I'm thinking of my next backup plan. Many people are afraid of a recession. I'm freaking scared of war, and it may come to Europe. To cut a long story short, just make sure you have a safe backup and ensure you can use it in time. Story 11. This wasn't my experience, but my mom's right when the Iran-Iraq war ended. The very first day border restrictions were lifted, my mom hopped on a bus with one bag from Baghdad to Jordan and never went back. It was very hard for her because she never thought she would ever leave, but her whole family was leaving one by one, all heading in different directions when they got the chance. She didn't want to admit it, but she wished she had left sooner. Everything was deteriorating from education to city upkeep. The population of certain villages was disappearing without a trace due to termination. She even had a really bad gut feeling that something much worse was going to happen to Iraq, and every sign told her to leave. Her gut feeling ended up being right. Even my dad's side realized it too. My family is Christian and there was no minority rights in Iraq at the time and even now. In the early 2000s, I forget the exact year, 2 of my uncles were taken and brought to a mosque. They were given 1 week to pack up and leave because they were Christian. The only reason they didn't terminate them was because they saw they had kids, so they spared them. They left as fast as they could and went to Syria. Then boom, the civil war started and they had to leave soon after that, starting a new life in Canada. Story 12. My parents left South Africa around 1980. They're white, so the apartheid government didn't restrict their travel. They left in their mid-20s after experiencing adult life under apartheid, including increasing horror about the state violence being committed against blacks and coloreds in their name. My dad was completing science postgraduate studies that would have led to working in a science-based public service. He was already doing an internship in that public service, but he suddenly stopped being allocated work. It turned out that he had been blacklisted for government work because my uncle was a very, very minor anti-apartheid journalist that had also been conscripted into the army, as all young white men were, and when they finally left, his next period of service would have put him on the front line of the Angolan War. He didn't want to terminate people. Dad qualified for a skilled migrant visa for Australia, and I was born here. My mother had also had enough of being a legal minor just because she was married. She became an adult at 18, like we all do, but because of her gender, she became a legal minor again when she got married. Dad became her legal guardian. My parents had a postnuptial agreement specifying that Dad allowed her to make her own legal decisions, like opening a bank account for the money she earned at her professional job. However, services would read the postnup and then still call my dad to get his permission for her to do whatever it was that she was trying to do. My journalist uncle migrated to the UK at around the same time. He went back for a family wedding. My parents sent their apologies in the early 1980s, and he was nabbed by military police within 12 hours of entering the country. He was forced to serve another tour of duty in the army. At some other point, his home in the UK was broken into, and the only thing that was taken was his address book. My family believes this was done by South African government agents to intimidate him. All of this was supposed to be in the past. We were supposed to have learned and grown. Story 13. For my family, when my grandmother was picked up by men in uniform while he was Christmas shopping with my mom and aunt, he told them he just needed to talk to them and sent them to continue shopping. 1971. They were in their teens when this happened. They never saw him again. We have no idea where he is, as people my family suspected who knew took the secret to the grave. Growing up, we were told he was in the States. They shielded us from the truth, so we won't talk about it as kids. Story 14. Not the point of OP, but I love how easy some people in privileged countries think it is, not only to leave everything you've known, but also to find acceptance and community in a new country that might not be in a place welcome to you. Asking questions like, should I leave? Is XYZ a good place to go? Online, as if deciding an appliance to buy based on reviews. Uprooting and transplanting yourself in another country is one of the hardest things you'll ever do, not to mention those who did it in life or doomed circumstances. We need to have a lot more respect for those who have done it. Story 15. My great-uncle and aunt, they lived in Berlin along with the rest of my family in the 1930s. They started saying that this movement was starting to become worrisome. Everyone else in the family called them paranoid and accused them of overreacting. They left anyway. They didn't seek consensus. They made it to the USA. Everyone else, including my grandparents, ended up in the concentration camps. As a result, my father always told me that if the political winds change, smelling authoritarian, never think, it can't happen here. Get out. Have an exit strategy. It's not all Trump and the rise of fascism in the US. I felt this way for a while. Mass incidents every week, people passing away from treatable conditions because of a for-profit healthcare system, which as we get older will harm us all, our retirement funds used to bet in the market, evolution being banished from textbooks in many cases. It's been squirrely here since at least 1992. Ironically, I'm now planning a permanent move to Germany. I was given citizenship as part of a reparations program in the 90s. Now, of course, that means all the EU. Full circle, I guess. Story 16. My family left Poland when it was under the Soviet sphere's influence in 1984. I was 5 at the time. My old man had been writing for the Solidarność underground newspaper and been given up by someone. I remember the police coming to my apartment to arrest my dad. He did 2 years in a Polish prison for subversive writing. After his release, we were told to get the hell out of Poland, so we had no choice. We ended up in Canada and lived there ever since. Now we have Trump on our doorstep, and my old man is absolutely livid. Story 17. I don't judge anyone who feels the need to leave the United States, but I don't think I can. I believe too strongly in the American idea to give up on it without a fight. I love this country and its inspirational charter. We have yet to live up to the American idea, but we've made a lot of progress. Now we're backsliding. It could be that we're close to a nadir and we'll come out of this or not. Either way, I think I'm going to see this through to the end. It would be a terrible thing for the future of humanity if the United States falls. We'd be ceding global leadership to the likes of China and Russia. To be clear, I have no ill will towards the Chinese or Russian people, but their political regimes cannot be entrusted with global hegemony. The current United States can't either. Humanity deserves better. What we're dealing with are a bunch of collective action problems. I'm really not sure if the American people are capable of the collective action required to get out of this, but it's not clear that we aren't capable of it either. I think there's hope. We've got to get to work. Story 18. Not authoritarian per se, but my home country is basically an evangelical majority that I suspect in the distant future might become a religious authoritarian regime if the evangelical radicals continue to gain influence and brainwash people. I left there and never looked back. I'm not going to wait for things to unfold. The world has fewer barriers than people think. Most of those barriers are in our heads. Yes, it is hard. Yes, you suffer. Yes, it is miles and miles away from your comfort zone, but it is doable. Story 19. I fled to Canada from the USA. Does that count? I knew it was time to leave after I read the 1619 Project. It was a brilliant series of essays in the New York Times Magazine. I just remember the blowback it received and the lack of serious attention it generated, and I knew the writing was on the wall. First Charlottesville, then 1619, then Homeland Security and unmarked vans snatching George Floyd protesters off the street, and then detaining them without any charges or explanations. That happened in my hometown of Portland, Oregon. For a few weeks, we could hear the protesters fighting with police from our bedroom window. It was literal anarchy, with white protesters shouting racist words at black cops, cops instigating and hurting innocent protesters, and always somebody smashing windows and lighting crap on fire. None of it made sense. I hope things get better, but history tells me otherwise. History tells me that I am incredibly lucky to live in America during an absolutely idyllic and extended period of peace and prosperity. Suburban nights smoking Colombians and playing frisbee under the streetlights, seeing the Grateful Dead in all their glory with Bob Dylan in Philadelphia, road trips through an America that hadn't yet succumbed to corporate homogenization. Christ, I've had a beautiful life. I just hope that would squeak through under the wire without having to see a soldier push an old man in a wheelchair off a fourth-floor balcony. But the thirst for fascism is strong now, everywhere. The thirst is rising. Stephen Miller is ascendant. He's growing into his true form and he feeds on human misery. So now I'm in Canada. I worry about my phone being seized at the border where American agents will demand access to all of my social media and personal emails. I've been deeply critical of Trump because that is an American value. Look at how far we've come. Story 20. During the protests in 2020, I was detained by a large group of officers after someone reported suspicious activity. They believed I was involved in something dangerous, but in reality, I was just buying diesel for my boat. I didn't realize that buying diesel was a crime, but the FBI was there and questioned me. I got out of jail the next day with a disturbing the peace charge and decided that was too much. I've been planning to sail to the Bahamas just for fun, but I just kept going instead. I'm scraping by. I thought maybe I had overreacted because Biden seemed pretty chill, but now I'm happy I left, and there's a 0% chance I'm going back. Story 21. Cuba. My husband and I watched the gorgeous movie Sweet Havana by Cuban director Fernando Perez. The movie has no dialogue or barely any, just music. It follows a day in the lives of regular Cubans. I remember sitting in silence after the movie ended, looking at my husband, and he was moved as I was. I told him, we have to leave. With the help of friends, one Canadian and another American, we were able to apply to a Canadian immigration program and left in 2006. My husband worked for a science research institute, and we knew it would be almost impossible to be allowed to leave. Back then, you needed government permission to travel abroad or to emigrate. So he left his job and worked at 2 different places consecutively to erase having worked at the research center, as they only asked about your last 2 jobs. We also hid that his parents were in the military. They took our apartment. Back then, you weren't allowed to buy or sell houses legally, only swap, but we were able to leave. And if you're learning a thing or two from these stories so far, please remember to hit that subscribe and like button for more videos just like this. Story 22. When news became propaganda, way before protests and actual crackdowns. I'm from Hong Kong and grew up with democracy and freedom of speech. In 2015, I was eating dinner and saw a curious news report. The journalist was reporting that a government bank vehicle full of cash had broken down and cash was flying around everywhere on the street. Hong Kongers were reported to have been stealing money, while miraculously not a single mainland Chinese person took any money and instead returned every single dollar down to the penny to the government bank. If you know anything about Beijing and mainland Chinese culture, you'd laugh at that idea that Chinese people would put a bank institution before themselves. The obvious propaganda just casually on TV was a clear bane for me that my city, my hometown, my rugged concrete jungle homeland was on its way down. Story 23. I'm a brown trans woman from urban Texas. I now live very far away. I knew the writing was on the wall with Citizens United versus FEC. I knew that the clock was really ticking after the first Trump election. I made my plans to emigrate accordingly. It took some doing, but I got out and resettled my life 3 years ago. It's true, uprooting so completely and thoroughly is a massive undertaking. But looking at the state of things now in the US, my fears feel completely founded. As far as what data points I considered, I can't point to just one thing, but there were 100 little signs. The fact that even in perhaps the most diverse city in the world, NYC, brown trans women were regularly getting terminated at rates of hundreds of times higher than average. The parallels in both the economic situation, instability, market collapses, corruption, and political rhetoric, nationalism from both major parties in, say, 1920s and 1930s Germany were striking. At the time, trans acceptance was spreading as a movement, but the embers of the reactionary movement, bathroom bills, women in sports, were already starting to pop up in elected official speech in the South. People in intersecting marginalized groups are the first impacted and the worst impacted, were used as a threat. Sure, your life is bad, but look at them, you could be treated worse, so shut up and get back to work. So I think my identities made me especially sensitive to these leading factors. Story 24. Politicians convinced 90% of the population that all their problems were because of the other 10%. The politicians robbed the country while the poor blamed other civilians who looked like them but had different languages and customs. There were restrictions put on the 10% since my grandfather's time, but most of that didn't deter my parents. The turning point for my parents was the riots, where leaked consensus data helped identify people's racial identities, so angry mobs could hurt as much of the 10% as they could. Once the riots ended, my parents noped out with me. A lot of people stayed through part of or even all of the ensuing civil war. So remember, no matter how bad it is, it can always get worse, and it's never too late to leave. It just gets harder. Story 25. When they won another election, I used to be a volunteer worker at the polls in Venezuela in 2013 and prior. I saw firsthand how the military took over the vote count and just did whatever they wanted with it, pointing their guns at us volunteers, and then threatening us when asked to see actual evidence of the final vote count that somehow always went their way in a writing that was very, very clearly against. Story 26. My great-aunt Maria fled Germany when Mein Kampf was published. She was gay. She understood with clarity that when he wrote about undesirables, she was most definitely included. First, she fled to a nearby country, can't recall where, but as he rose to power after leaving prison, she fled all the way to Peru, lived a long, full, happy life there. It's a lesson my family takes very seriously. We're Canadian, my kids are 19 and 22. We're taking steps to get German citizenship, just on the off chance things get freaking weird. And even that is just a first step. The true destination would be Kerala, India. My wife's family's from there, and that feels just about far enough away from this nonsense. It's all just hypothetical now, but I want us to have options, just in case. Story 27. When the US Embassy closed, they started throwing protesting students in the Nile. And then they started dragging power stations and oil refinery workers out of their homes. Then the neighborhood boys started digging trenches and piling boulders in the streets to slow down the armored trucks. Then the water and electricity were cut and people had to decide between drinking and washing. At that point, my family had to get out. That night, I spent calling the US Embassy in Jeddah over and over for hours to help my mother get out was one of the longest nights of my life. Story 28. I left the US in 2006, but we started planning when the Department of Homeland Security was created. September 11 offered a few paths for the US to follow. It was obvious to my husband and me that our country was choosing the wrong one. There were so many other issues, lack of health care for people, how quickly people turned on their neighbors, the security theater that started happening in airports, rising gun violence, unwillingness to properly fund schools. It was all tests for what people would accept and training them to accept it. I've done a lot of traveling. I was in Thailand when mass protests kicked off again in 2014. I was in Belgrade when the government protests kicked off against lockdown restrictions in 2020, etc. You can feel it. You can feel the frustrations in the air. You can see increased police presence and the citizens' fear. And the instant one group is targeted as the problem, you have a problem. The US is following the playbooks to a T. Story 29. When the plans for Project 2025 were leaked, I learned extensively in school about how came to power in 1930s Germany, and reading the documents rang alarm bells for me. I smelled what's happening in the US now coming a mile away. In 2024, I finished my university degree, casted a postal ballot, blue all the way down, that was counted, and fled to Australia just 12 days before the election took place. To this day, I've been picking up the odd job here and there to keep myself afloat. Watching the USA devolving into an authoritarian fascist state from the outside is like watching the Titanic sink from the relative safety of a lifeboat. Story 30. So many people are saying how hard it is to leave. Of course it is. I mean, if you're from a population that caused the problem, then other governments are going to be wary of allowing you in and maybe causing the same problem for them. See Putin's little green men. And that's outside, just a normal, why do we want you? But if so many English teachers in Southeast Asia do the various tourist visa, in and out refreshes, and so on, it isn't actually that hard. I mean, they are maybe not the geniuses of the world, and bunches of them do it based on the amazing skill of, I speak English. What it comes down to is just how bad you think it will get and how far down in lifestyle you think the trade-off is. If a person thinks living as a constantly stressed illegal working in Bangkok teaching English, which they don't actually know how to do, is too far down the chain compared to their likely risks, then they won't do it. If they guess wrong on the risk factor, then things suck either way. Realistically, if 20 years ago you started building skills, which you got lucky and every country wants now, and there would be no way of guessing which ones were important, then you'd be gold. I get visas everywhere, and I'm a little bit away from my third passport, so I am biased. And people like me make it look both easy and impossible. There's no way you're catching my 25 years of experience in a week, which could make it feel impossible. But if you are actually worried about your country terminating you, then just look at the fun-loving idiots having a tan and eating great food in some other country and weigh your risks. If you think you will be terminated or deported to a prison no one leaves alive, then maybe the tan and food make up for the chaos of that particular lifestyle. Story 31. My father escaped East Germany via Prague as a 17, 18-year-old. He had no family and went into the overcrowded West German embassy because he just needed to get out. He was involved in the anti-party movements, could not get home without fear of the Stasi, and his mother and sister were spying on him, unbeknownst to him. He got to West Germany with statelessness, got new papers, and then just left and kept going. He met my mother in Paris when she was a tourist and then ended up in Japan. He's happy now. Story 32. You don't. When Yugoslavia collapsed, people were in denial about what was about to happen, even after bullets started flying. Normalcy bias is a hell of a substance, and you will try to convince yourself things aren't as bad, and people around you will be doing the same. Now here's the problem, the real problem. When getting out is still easy, when you can just hop on a plane or into a car and leave, things aren't that bad and you don't have to leave. By definition, it's only when you can't leave, when it's difficult and dangerous to try, that it becomes truly necessary. Obviously, you should leave before that, but there's likely not going to be a clearly telegraphed message that the blade is coming down. Just remember Liberation Day. Everyone knew something was wrong, but some people just didn't know how bad it was genuinely going to be. And this is economics. People doing planning are trained to assume the worst and were given instructions to prepare for the worst, and everyone still underestimated what would happen even though they had a pretty good idea up front. If there's conscription, a travel ban, or people getting rounded up, the first warning might be a knock on your door. If you feel unsafe, start taking steps immediately. If you have a job lined up, a place to stay, and all your documents are in order, leaving is easy. And the fallout, if you get it wrong, is minimal. People leave their countries all the time. It's not a huge deal. If, however, you see that you might be in imminent danger and you don't even have a passport or a clear idea of where you want to go, you're way more likely to stay in a lethal situation due to the sheer fear of the unknown. Story 33. I didn't escape. We Serbian students spent day after day protesting, rain or shine, hot or cold. Police pestered us all the time. It didn't deter us. I remember the elections when Milosevic was overturned, an elderly lady that my parents had known for a long time. My dad rented a room in her and her husband's house when he was studying, and they stayed in contact, called to ask who I voted for. When I said anti-him, she hung up and never talked to me again. I remember how people were trying to cheat and fight in order to get him more votes. We were getting some special stamps on our hands to show we had already voted, and they were trying to force their way in after already having voted to vote again. I remember when we got rid of Milosevic as clear as day, the day everybody was on the streets and we were afraid of a civil war, but luckily the police and army realized enough was enough and they refused to harm the people. Unfortunately, it seems our younger generations have to do it all over again. Story 34. My grandma, mom, and her siblings left on one of the first flights after Idi Amin's coup. Tragically, my grandpa was a well-known lawyer and leader, and he didn't survive the night of the coup. Being the oldest kid, my mom is the only one who remembers that night. She remembers when the soldiers came to their house looking for my grandpa. They all thought they were going to pass away. They held a gun to my great auntie as she held my youngest uncle. They mistook her for my grandma because my grandma is an African. Then one of them said they located my grandpa and they left. The next day, my grandma ripped up whatever leftover money the army wouldn't steal. Then they were on a flight to Canada with hundreds of other people. Story 35. One of my best friends is from Venezuela. Her husband worked for an international bank and he requested a transfer to Mexico City in 2003 when Chavez was president. They saw the writing on the wall and realized what was happening. They moved to Mexico and even became Mexican citizens. In 2018, Andrés Manuel López Obrador became the president of Mexico. He, like Trump, is a nutcase who began taking Mexico in a very different direction. Although he's a self-described social democrat, in reality, he was very much an autocrat. Last year, his term ended and Claudia Sheinbaum is the current president from the same party as López Obrador. My friends began to have the same fears they had in Venezuela. They again requested a transfer, this time to Spain. They moved this past December and will now actively pursue Spanish citizenship. Since Trump became president in the US again, my friends not only feared Mexico, they feared for the future of North America, which is why they decided to leave the continent. I completely understand their fears, particularly after what they went through in Venezuela and having their whole family now scattered throughout the world. And although Mexico is a worrying country today, and everyone I know is again Sheinbaum, seeing that she has stood up to Trump, albeit not as strongly as Canada has, I'm hopeful and optimistic that Mexico will not go down the path of the USA and Venezuela. Story 36. If you're going to panic, panic early. Get out while the getting is good, then you don't have to panic anymore. I say this as someone stuck here with my family. A month ago, I resigned myself to what this means, going about my daily life and providing for my family until that's just not an option anymore. Could be a battering ram at the door because I commented too much on Reddit and because I failed to show a warrant. Could be a complete collapse of our society. Could be a work accident, no telling. I'm open to the possibility of leaving if it becomes a viable option. Certainly haven't given up on the idea. But I'll put it this way, my pantry is full, I have extra gas I cycle through, If my children were old enough, I would be mortgaging the house to send them to school in another country. Story 37. I realized it was time to leave when fear became a normal part of daily life, not just fear of big things like imprisonment, but fear of speaking openly, fear of trusting neighbors, fear of having an opinion. When you catch yourself calculating every word you say, when you stop recognizing your own voice in conversations, that's when you know you're not truly living anymore. The moment I realized that hope had become more dangerous than silence, I knew I had to leave. Staying meant slowly passing away inside. Leaving meant at least a chance at life. Story 38. I'm from Ukraine. I was lucky enough to move out 9 years ago. My mom worked part-time as a choir singer in church and had to sing lots of funeral rites for very young soldiers, even 9 years old, so that was kind of a first sign. About a month before the war started, all civilian flights were suspended, and so that was very suspicious. I asked my family to move out of the country, but they told me everything would be okay, and also Zelensky went on TV saying war would not happen. Well, guess what happened next? I got scammed a lot of times trying to find a driver to get my family out after the war started, but eventually got them out. Right now, Ukrainian authorities are rounding up all military-age males they can find and sending them to the front lines with minimal training. Lots of my friends and some of my relatives have passed away already. Story 39. I read an article called something like Alarmism Saved My Family from by Hugo somebody, and it made an impression on me. It had a bit where the grandfather kept saying, there have been anti-Semites in the past, this is no difference, this will pass. And the grandmother had this instinct that something was different this time, that something worse was coming, and convinced the family to leave for England. And they were the ones that survived. A lot of the extended family passed away. I had the same feeling back in 2016. Republicans had been running on this kind of racist populism for a while, but I felt like it was obvious that something was different this time, a kind of angry, gleeful celebration of hate and violence. A candidate who didn't even hide the authoritarian part, who talked openly about doing cruel, undemocratic things, who was openly fascist and vindictive and mean, and people loved it. It was pretty clear that this was different. At the time, it wasn't clear we were definitely going to go full fascist authoritarian, but it was obvious that the chances were significant. A 10% chance of falling into dictatorship is too high. Anyway, I knew it was time to leave in 2016, so I left in 2017. Story 40. A friend and colleague I worked with from 2006 to 2008 was from Iran and in his 50s back then. He had just married his wife in Iran a few years ago after Khomeini took over. At first, things got worse, much worse for women, but life for him wasn't that bad. Then one day, a truck arrived in his village, and from the back of it, an edict of sorts was read aloud by basically former residents of the villages, or losers who had been ostracized or banned from the villages for various reasons before that. The edict led to a bunch of people from the village, including my colleague's dad, being taken away and arrested. They were all terminated with no trials. My colleague planned to fly out of Iran and somehow got out, flying to East Berlin. From there, he walked to West Berlin. No one cared about Middle Eastern people crossing. There was a loophole. And then eventually made it to Denmark, where he started life again as a software developer. But his dad and uncles didn't make it, so it was pretty bad. Story 41. Escape might be a strong word, but we lived in a West African country to do humanitarian work, and there was a massive fire that destroyed most of the national funeral reserves. Now, this is a country that was already a military dictatorship, that had already been political unrest, and things just kept getting worse. There were always protests where people were inevitably terminated by the police, but then it got worse. Eventually, there were cuts to power without warning. You never knew when or if it would come back on. And the internet was basically constantly blocked. It started with social media, but eventually everything was shut off. They bragged about purchasing Israeli technology to stop the flow of the internet. We returned to the US in February of 2024, but I had already seen the writing on the wall in 2016, and in the meantime, my wife and I had 2 kids. I decided it would be best to return to the European country where we had studied the lingua franca before deploying to West Africa. I learned the language to great fluency and was able to find a job in my field despite not having qualifications on paper. I returned in November of 2024, and we were reunited in March of this year. It's complicated and challenging to leave, but we knew it would be much worse if we tried to stay. Story 42. My boyfriend dreamt of America while living under Ceausescu in Romania. He would smuggle jeans into the country, and his prized possessions were a pair of cowboy boots. After Ceausescu fell, my boyfriend had the opportunity to apply for a lottery visa and was fortunate enough to get it. Moving to the US was a step backward. He had been a practicing veterinarian in Romania, he had no money, and he didn't speak English. However, the opportunities available in the US ignited his determination, and he worked hard and achieved success more than he ever imagined. Now, however, he's not sure he would make the same move given the political climate. He notices troubling similarities between his experiences in Romania and some of the political favoritism and power dynamics happening today. Story 43. My Italian grandparents lived in Lyon, France for 20 plus years. During the early days of World War II, the French police arrested my grandfather, a World War I veteran, questioned him about his citizenship, and when they didn't like his answers, put him on a train heading back to Italy. They then turned around and questioned my grandmother and gave her a choice to stay in France with her 2 children or join her husband in Italy. The entire family was shipped back to Italy with just the clothes on their backs. These police actions were a common enough occurrence that Mussolini allowed the returning refugees to relocate anywhere in Italy instead of being forced back to their small hometowns with limited opportunities, sharecropping, and grinding poverty. My grandparents ended up in Rome, my grandfather joined the ranks of the Carabinieri, and they got access to government-issued housing and support. One of their kids passed away soon after the forced relocation due to a heart condition. My grandmother had 2 other children during the war, and they all vividly recall the air raids, limited food supplies, and the arrival of foreign troops. And if any of these stories got to you, here's more for you. YouTube thinks you're gonna love this. I'll catch you in that video.